Welcome back to Historic Investments. Today we're going to talk about one of the most iconic of Japanese handguns. No, it's not the Grandpa Nambu, it's the Papa Nambu. But if you're a family man, you're going to need all three. You're going to need the Grandpa, the Papa, and the Baby. And the toughest to find in original condition is the Papa. So we're going to talk about the Papas, not all of them, just those assembled by TG&E. An early and a last example. Contrast them, talk about the holster, and give you a lot more information. If you like what you see, please hit the like button, subscribe. We'll be happy to answer your questions. But for right now, let's take a look at these Papas. The Papa Nambu was initially manufactured by the Tokyo Arsenal as a modification of the Grandpas, introduced in 1906 and manufactured on a somewhat of an intermittent basis until 1928. At a certain point, and most people agree, 1909, in other words, 3 years after its introduction, production was picked up by the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company, as the Tokyo Arsenal per se could not fulfill all of the military orders. There are some very basic differences between the guns manufactured by TG&E and those by the Tokyo Arsenal. Let's take a look at one of the earliest TG&E pistols. It's a serial number 579, and then we're going to skip to the very end of production and look at that special 8000 serial range in which the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company, unable to supply its own parts fast enough, actually used some of the Tokyo Arsenal's earlier parts to fabricate its last guns. Between the Tokyo Arsenal and the TG&E pistols, the Japanese assembled 10,300 Papa Nambus. Those made by TG&E were sequentially numbered in their own separate serial range, going from 1 to approximately 5,000, and with a separate overrun between 8,000 and about 8,700. Let's take a look at this first gun, which is a fairly early production gun. It's serial number 579, and it has all of the typical characteristics of guns assembled by TG&E. On the right side of the barrel extension, as you can see right here, we've got the serial number, and then we've got the three symbol kanji markings that mean Nambu type. To the left, you'll see a stamped anchor. And for those familiar with Papa Nambus, you know there are two anchor types. There's the lightly stamped anchor and the much more dramatic scribed or milled thickened anchor form. But the early guns have the stamped anchor, just like this one. On the left side of the extension are these markings. Hopefully you can see them right here, and that just means Army type. At the top of the chamber is the encircled TG&E, which of course was marked on all of the TG assembled guns. As per all Papas, it has the tangent sight. It has a convex knurled striker guide. It's got a movable lanyard ring. Compared to the Grandpa, it's got an oversized trigger guard, and it's got a slightly differently contoured trigger with flat rather than rounded sides. And of course, as is immediately apparent, the frame has been recontoured, and the magazines have now been fitted with an aluminum base. If you read a little bit about Papa Nambus, you've probably heard the reference of a one-piece or a two-piece frame. The Tokyo Arsenal made guns with a one-piece frame. TG&E didn't quite have the machining at the time and decided it would be easier to make the guns with a two-piece frame. Well, this is an early TG&E, so of course it has a two-piece frame. How can you tell? Well, there are two ways, and the easiest by far is just to look at the tang area. If the surface is milled flat, in other words, if there's no recess here, it is a two-piece frame. But if you really look, you can see a couple of things here. For one thing, you can see a pin. There it is. There's the pin right there. And if you really look hard, you can see where the parts have been pieced together, right in that area. The other thing that I wanted to mention about the frame is that the early TG&Es, and this was also true for the Tokyo Arsenal guns, but the early TG&Es were all slotted for a shoulder stock. And here you go, right here. However, let me point out that they were never issued with a stock. No TG&E pistols were ever issued with a stock. It was thought at the time that fitting the guns with a shoulder stock might be a good idea, but by the time the guns were actually in production, that idea had long passed. So the slots were filled with a little bit of a softer metal. Sometimes you'll find a TG&E with an open slot, and that was done afterwards by an enterprising collector who maybe wanted to fit his gun to a more recently made shoulder stock or a loose stock that was just found. But in any event, the guns as issued, the earliest ones were slotted, had the slots filled, and that's the way they were issued. The later TG&E guns were not slotted. By the time TG&E had finished its first 5,000 guns, several other events had unfolded. By that time, for example, the Tokyo Arsenal had decided to phase out production of its Papas and had moved some of its machinery and parts to a TG&E who used those parts in its late assembly. So, beginning with serial number 8,000, going from about 8,000 to 8,700, the frames were actually Tokyo Arsenal frames. And as you might remember from the first part of the video, the early TG&E frames were two-piece and were solid in this area. In other words, did not have a milled out section. This is a single-piece frame as made by the Tokyo Arsenal with the milled out section here. Another difference that you'll immediately notice is that it has the Tokyo Arsenal 3 cannonballs to the left of the kanji markings and the serial number. Another thing that you'll notice, and this is something that's found on a number of Papa Nambus, are the painted unit numbers that are usually but not always found on the right grip. It's usually with a somewhat off-white paint. Sometimes it's yellow. Very infrequently it's red. And these were usually applied by the special naval landing forces. Here's another example of one of the magazines. This is a typical Papa Nambu magazine with the aluminum base, and you'll see, as per the other Nambus with which you're no doubt much more familiar, the full serial number is applied at the base of the spine. Primary magazines do not have a dot. The secondary magazines are dotted. Some of you might not be familiar with a correct Papa holster, so let's just do a brief review of that item. Here's such an example. You can see some of the paint remnants from the unit number. Many of them have been identified by the capturing GIs. In this case, it's Chuck Rooney. No, the holsters were not marked Chuck Rooney when they left the factory. But the key is, if you just go by a table slowly, or look at the auction house and you just have a picture of a holster, it's really pretty hard to tell these apart from a standard T14 holster. So what you need to do is you need to open up the lid. And the key is the pouch here. So if you see a trapezoidal pouch like this, look at that. Rooney must have really liked this holster. He put his name on the flap here. But anyway, if you see a trapezoidal pouch like this, this is a Papa holster. A T14 holster would be much smaller, and the pouch would have more of a squared rather than a trapezoidal configuration. And just as Chuck Rooney liked to put his name on it, it's not that unusual for the holster to be somewhat personalized by the Japanese owner. So hopefully you found this a useful review of the Papa Nambus made by TG&E. You learned about the early guns with the two-piece frames and the solid tang and the stamped anchor. You've learned about the very late guns with the one-piece frame, milled panel here, whose parts were supplied by the Tokyo Arsenal. You learned about what constitutes a proper Papa Nambu holster, and for this information and a lot more, let me just very strongly recommend this book on Japanese military cartridge handguns, 1893 to 1945, that was written by Harry Derby and James Brown. It's really, really a great book, and if you're at all interested in either the Papa Nambus, the Grandpa Nambus, the babies, or any other Japanese handguns, this is the book that should be in your library. Thanks again for having tuned into Historic Investments. Hopefully you've learned a few new things about the TG&E assembled Papa Nambus. Good luck with your search and good collecting.